The Tennessee summer of 1841 was not merely hot, it was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the red clay and the dusty hats of the men gathered in the grove at Dancyville. The air was thick with the scent of cured tobacco and the sweat of 1,000 farmers who had ridden miles to witness the spectacle. They had not come for policy. They had come for blood. On the wooden platform, crudely constructed from rough-hewn timber, stood two men who represented the collision of two distinct worlds. On the left stood James Knox Polk, the incumbent governor of Tennessee. He was a man carved from granite, stiff, humorless, and impeccably dressed in a frock coat that seemed impervious to the heat. His eyes were gray and calculating, the eyes of a man who had survived a harrowing surgery without anesthesia as a boy and had never truly relaxed since. He was known as the Napoleon of the Stump for his aggressive, argumentative style, but today the Napoleon was facing a guerrilla fighter he could not understand. Opposite him lounged the challenger, James Chamberlain Jones. They called him Lean Jimmy, and the nickname was an understatement. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall but weighed a scarce 125 pounds. He looked less like a politician and more like a scarecrow animated by a mischievous spirit. His limbs were impossibly long and gangly, and his face was a theater of grotesque expressions. Polk stepped forward, raising a hand to silence the crowd. He began to speak on the intricacies of the independent treasury and the dangers of a national bank. His voice was disciplined, his logic unassailable. He cited statutes, referenced economic fluctuations, and built a cathedral of argumentation. He was treating the electorate like a jury, demanding they respect the weight of the evidence. The federal government, Polk intoned, his voice cutting through the humid air, must not become the instrument of the speculator. We must guard the public purse with the vigilance of a sentinel. He spoke for an hour. The crowd listened with respectful boredom. When Polk finished, he stepped back, wiping a single bead of perspiration from his forehead with a linen handkerchief. He had won the argument. He was sure of it. Then Lean Jimmy unfolded himself from his chair. He did not walk to the front of the platform. He shambled. He looked at the crowd, then at Polk, and then back at the crowd. He let a silence hang, a goofy grin spreading across his face. "Did you hear the governor?" Jones asked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched mimicry of Polk's serious baritone. "He's guardin' the purse. He's guardin' it so tight he's squeezed the life out of it." The crowd erupted. Jones didn't debate. He performed. He took a piece of coonskin from his pocket and stroked it, winking at the farmers. He told a story about a mule that refused to plow, equating the mule's stubbornness with Polk's policy. He flailed his long arms, mimicking Polk's precise gestures but exaggerating them until Polk looked like a mechanical toy. Polk sat frozen. He watched the faces of the men he had governed. They were laughing. They were leaning forward, their eyes bright with affection for the ungainly creature mocking him. Polk felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He realized with a dawning horror that his logic was useless here. These men did not want to be lectured. They wanted to be seen. Jones was making them feel like he was one of them, a neighbor sharing a joke at the general store. Polk was the schoolmaster, and school was out. As the debate ended and the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, distorted shadows across the platform, Polk moved through the crowd. He extended his hand to a man in a homespun shirt. "Good evening, sir," Polk said stiffly. "I hope I have your support." The man took the hand, but his eyes drifted over Polk's shoulder to where Lean Jimmy was slapping backs and remembering the name of a local hound dog. "Mighty fine speech, Governor," the man muttered, but the connection wasn't there. Polk moved to the next man, and the next. The interactions were hollow. He was shaking hands with ghosts. He knew their demographics, their county, their voting history, but he did not know them. And because he did not know them, he was losing them. The defeat in 1841 was not a landslide, but it was a humiliation. James K. Polk, the protege of Andrew Jackson, The man who had been Speaker of the House had been beaten by a jester. He had lost by a mere 3,000 votes, a margin that haunted him. It meant that for every 100 men he had spoken to, if he had just turned 2 of them, the result would have been different. He retreated to his home in Columbia, Tennessee. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the dust and noise of the campaign trail. The walls were lined with books, law, history, philosophy. These had always been his sanctuary, his weapons. Now they seemed impotent. He sat at his heavy oak desk, the surface cluttered with correspondence. The silence of the room was heavy, amplified by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. He replayed the campaign in his mind. He saw lean Jimmy Jones laughing, his long arms waving. He saw the voters turning away. He realized that Jones possessed a natural gift that he, Polk, did not, the gift of easy familiarity. Jones could meet a stranger and make him feel like a brother in 5 minutes. Polk could lecture a stranger for an hour and leave him feeling like a student. "I cannot change my nature," Polk whispered to the empty room. He looked at his hands. They were pale, the hands of a lawyer, not a plowman. He could not learn to be funny. He could not learn to be raucous. The very idea of it repulsed his stoic sensibilities. But Polk possessed a different kind of power, a terrifying capacity for labor. He possessed a mind that could organize chaos. If he could not charm the voters with emotion, he would bind them with precision. If he could not make them laugh, he would make them feel important. He pulled a fresh, leather-bound ledger from his drawer. He opened it to the first blank page. The paper was cream-colored, thick and inviting. He dipped his quill into the inkwell, the black liquid pooling on the nib. He thought of the man in the homespun shirt at Dancyville. What was his name? He didn't know. He hadn't asked. Or, if he had let it slip through the sieve of his mind, discarded as irrelevant data. That was the error. That was the leak in the vessel. Polk stared at the blank page. The flickering candlelight cast deep shadows across his face, turning the hollows of his cheeks into dark pools. He was not just preparing for another campaign. He was preparing to alter the fundamental architecture of his own mind. He was about to turn himself into a machine. He began to write. He did not write a speech. He did not write a policy paper. He wrote a name, then another, then a location. William T. Avery, Hardeman County, concerns regarding the price of cotton, wife unwell. He paused. The memory was faint, a scrap of conversation from 3 weeks ago. He forced his mind to retrieve it, straining against the fog of forgetfulness. He wrote it down. The scratch of the quill was loud in the silence. He realized then that the battle was not on the stage. The battle was here, in the ledger. If he could capture the electorate, one soul at a time, transcribe them into ink, and then reabsorb them into his brain, he would never be a stranger again. He would be omniscient. He sat there, the pen hovering over the paper, the list stretching out into the darkness of his imagination. He was on the precipice of an obsession that would consume his days and haunt his nights. He looked at the nib of the pen, glistening with ink, poised to strike the paper like a dagger. He took a breath, his eyes narrowing in the candlelight. He began to write again, faster this time. The list grew. The night deepened. He did not sleep. To understand the system James K. Polk was about to build, one must understand the foundation upon which it rested. Polk was a man forged in pain. At the age of 17, he had been strapped to a table in Danville, Kentucky to undergo a lithotomy, the surgical removal of urinary stones. There was no chloroform. There was only brandy, which he largely refused, and the gospel of duty his mother had instilled in him. The surgeon's knife had carved a lesson into his very nerves. The body could be mastered by the will. Pain was information. Endurance was a choice. This stoicism became the engine of his political resurrection. Following the defeat to Lean Jimmy, Polk initiated a regimen of mental conditioning that was unprecedented in American politics. He treated the electorate of Tennessee not as a crowd, but as a data set to be cataloged. The system operated on a cycle of acquisition, storage, and retrieval. On the road, Polk traveled with a small entourage of aides whose primary function was not security, but surveillance. As Polk moved through a crowd, shaking hands, his aides stood just outside the circle. They carried small notebooks. When a farmer introduced himself as Elias Thompson from Christian County and mentioned he was a bee hunter worried about the market for beeswax, Polk would nod and listen intently. Moments later, as he moved to the next voter, an aide would scribble, Elias Thompson, Christian Kerber bee hunter, beeswax market. The true labor began at night. While his opponents drank cider and slept, Polk sat in his lodgings with these notebooks. He transferred the raw data into his master ledgers. But transcription was only the first step. He had to internalize it. Polk utilized a variation of the method of loci, a mnemonic device used by Roman orators. He would close his eyes and visualize the map of Tennessee. He would mentally travel to Christian County. He would visualize the specific creek or crossroads where Elias Thompson lived. He would place Thompson there, perhaps imagining him holding a honeycomb. He attached the name to the geography. Elias Thompson, bee hunter, beeswax. He repeated this hundreds of times. He reviewed his lists before entering a town, memorizing the key figures, the tavern keepers, the militia captains, the outspoken farmers. The effect on the ground was electric. 2 years later, when Polk returned to that district, he spotted Thompson in the crowd. He did not hesitate. He walked straight to him, extending a hand. Elias Thompson, Polk said, his voice warm with fabricated recognition. Good to see you again. Tell me, how was the beeswax yield this season? Did the market stabilize? The shock on Thompson's face was the currency of Polk's power. Thompson did not see a politician. He saw a man who cared. He saw a man who had carried the memory of a humble bee hunter in his heart for 2 years. He did not know about the ledger. He did not know about the late-night rehearsals. He only knew that the Napoleon of the Stump knew him. This was the 20,000 names. It was not a magical photographic memory. It was the result of a crushing industrial workload. It was a cognitive infrastructure built brick by brick. Polk memorized the names of militia volunteers, local magistrates, and newspaper editors. He categorized them by loyalty: true, wavering, or federalist. He applied this same granular intensity to his estate management. Letters to his overseers regarding the enslaved people on his Mississippi plantation were chilling in their detail. He inquired about a blacksmith named Harry, asking specifically about the rheumatism in his ankles, directing the precise type of work he should perform. Even in the moral abyss of slavery, Polk's mind was a catalog of specific physicalities and utilities. He did not deal in generalities. As he prepared for the national stage, this system became his armor. He could not out-joke the Whigs. He could not out-drink them. But he could out-know them. He was building a mental map of the United States, populated by thousands of individuals he could call by name. He was ready to weaponize his memory. The year 1844 arrived, and with it, the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore. The party was in disarray. The giants of the era, Martin Van Buren, Lewis Cass, James Buchanan, were deadlocked. The convention hall was a cauldron of smoke, shouting, and stalemate. Ballot after ballot failed to produce a nominee. James K. Polk was not in Baltimore. He was at home, watching the mails, his network of correspondents sending him frantic updates. He was hoping for the vice presidency. But his memory machine had been at work. For years, he had corresponded with party bosses in every state, remembering their wives' names, their local feuds, their specific ambitions. He was the second choice of everyone, which meant he was the only choice for the whole. On the 8th ballot, a whisper began. On the 9th, it became a roar. The convention stampeded to Polk. He became the first dark horse candidate in American history. The Whig Party, led by the celebrity statesman Henry Clay, greeted the news with derision. They launched a slogan that was meant to be the ultimate insult: "Who is James K. Polk?" It was a fatal miscalculation. They assumed fame was the only metric of political weight. They did not understand the power of the ledger. Who is James K. Polk? The answer came from the bee hunters in Tennessee, the shopkeepers in Ohio, and the militia captains in New York. He is the man who knows my name. Polk ran a campaign of relentless discipline. While Henry Clay gave grand, contradictory speeches on the annexation of Texas, trying to please both the North and South, Polk remained rigid. He wanted Texas. He wanted Oregon. He wanted the continent. He directed the campaign from his study, micromanaging the editorials of the Nashville Union, instructing them to keep up the attack and not be thrown on the defense. The election was razor thin. Polk won New York by a sliver, and with it, the presidency. He had defeated the most famous man in America. Once in the White House, the memory system that had won the election became the tool of governance. Polk did not trust his subordinates. He delegated nothing. He reviewed every contract, every commission, every dispatch. When the Mexican-American War erupted, a war he provoked and managed with cold precision, Polk turned the White House into a command center. He claimed to have called for 20,000 volunteers, and he personally oversaw their apportionment. He knew the logistics of the supply trains better than the quartermaster general. He knew which officers were Whigs and which were Democrats, and he promoted them accordingly. He worked 18-hour days. He ceased to have a private life. His diary, a massive extension of his mental ledger, recorded everything. He noted the arrogant tone of Senator Stephen Douglas. He noted the duplicity of his Secretary of State, James Buchanan. He recorded the minute details of budget appropriations. The 20,000 names had become 20,000 facts, 20,000 miles of territory, 20,000 responsibilities. He was absorbing the entire executive branch into his own person. He was achieving his goals: the acquisition of California, the settlement of Oregon, the independent treasury. But the machine was beginning to overheat. The biological limits of the mind were being tested against the infinite complexity of a growing empire. 80 years after Polk burned his life force into the ledger, the United States had transformed. The population had exploded. The frontier was closed. The era of the face-to-face politician, who could personally memorize every key voter, was physically impossible. The scale of democracy had outstripped the capacity of the human brain. Enter James Aloysius Farley. If Polk was the artisan of political memory, Farley was its Henry Ford. In the 1930s, as the campaign manager for Franklin D. Roosevelt, Farley recognized that the fundamental psychological need of the voter remained unchanged. They still wanted to be recognized. They still wanted the Elias Thompson moment. But there were millions of them now. Farley, a bald, gum-chewing Irishman with the energy of a dynamo, systematized the Polk method. He created the Farley File. This was not a mental exercise. It was a bureaucratic institution. Farley kept a card index on tens of thousands of local Democratic officials, donors, and activists. The cards contained the standard data: name, address, position. But, like Polk, Farley knew that the power lay in the trivia. Wife's name: Martha. Kids: Timmy, age 8, Sarah, age 12. Hobbies: stamp collecting. Pet peeve: the local postmaster. Before Roosevelt arrived in a town, Farley would produce the Green Book, a dossier compiled from these files. Roosevelt, a man of immense natural charm but limited attention span, would study the book on the train. When the local delegation boarded, FDR would beam. "Hello, Bill," Roosevelt would boom. "How is Martha, and did Timmy get that bicycle he wanted?" The local official would melt. The President of the United States knew about Timmy's bicycle. The loyalty cemented in that moment was unbreakable. But Farley went further. He understood the power of the artifact. He sent letters, thousands of them, tens of thousands, and he signed every single one in green ink. The green ink was his trademark. It was a visual shout. It said, "This is not a form letter. This was signed by Jim." Even if the body of the letter was typed by a secretary, that bold emerald stroke at the bottom was a personal touch, a proxy for the handshake. Farley boasted that he knew 20,000 people by their first names. It was the same number attributed to Polk, a mythical figure that represented the theoretical limit of political connection. But where Polk held them in the agonizing grip of his own synapses, Farley held them in steel filing cabinets. The Farley machine powered the New Deal coalition. It built a bridge between the distant bureaucratic state and the individual citizen. It was the industrialization of intimacy. It proved that while the technology of politics changed, from the quill to the typewriter to the radio, the currency remained the same: recognition. Farley's system was robust. It could survive the illness of the candidate. It could survive the expansion of the electorate. It was detached from the biological fragility of the leader. Polk, however, had no such luxury. His system was him. We return to the candlelit room in Columbia, Tennessee. The year is 1849. James K. Polk sits at a desk, much like the one where he began his journey after the defeat to Lean Jimmy Jones. But the man sitting there is a husk. He is 53 years old, but he looks 70. His hair is long and gray, falling over a face that is drawn and skeletal. His eyes, once gray and piercing, are clouded with exhaustion. He has kept his promise. He served one term. He achieved every single objective he set for himself. He redrew the map of the continent, adding Texas, California, and the Southwest. He lowered the tariff. He established the Treasury. He won the war. But the ledger had exacted its price. The cliffhanger of 1841, that moment of resolve when he dipped his pen to conquer his own nature, had led to this. The decision to micromanage the mind of the electorate and then the mind of the government had burned him out. He had processed too much data, held too many details in the suspension of his own will. He had left Washington in March, a triumphal tour that felt more like a funeral procession. He was coughing, his body racked by the cholera that was sweeping up the Mississippi River. The gospel of duty had driven him to work through illness, through fatigue, through the protests of his body, until there was nothing left to fuel the machine. He looked at the papers on his desk. He tried to organize them, to file them, to catalog them, but his hands trembled. The mental palace where he had stored the names of 20,000 men was crumbling. The geography of Tennessee was blurring with the geography of Mexico. The face of Elias Thompson the bee hunter merged with the face of General Winfield Scott. He lay down on the bed at Polk Place. His wife, Sarah, who had been his partner in this great cognitive enterprise, sat by his side. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered. "For all eternity, I love you." These were his last words. He did not speak of the tariff. He did not speak of Oregon. He spoke of the one connection that did not require a ledger to remember. On June 15, 1849, just 3 months after leaving the White House, James K. Polk died. The machine stopped. He was the Napoleon of the stump, the man who defeated the charismatic giants of his age not with a smile, but with a list. He proved that in the American democracy the most powerful force is not rhetoric, but recollection. He memorized a nation, and in the process, he forgot to live. As they carried his coffin out of Polk Place, one can imagine the ghosts of 20,000 voters standing in silent tribute, men who believed briefly and brightly that the president knew their names. The ledger was closed, but the ink was indelible.